Hi, everyone. I'm Aimee Barnes, and I'll be your moderator for today's conversation about U.S. federal climate policy, realistic expectations, and federal enablers. I think, we've got part of our panel here, part of our panel Rick coming in virtually. So we'll start off with some questions and discussion, but really hope this will be more of a conversation and would welcome questions from the audience as well. So please feel free to raise your hand and let us know if you have anything that you want to ask. So, I think all of us have been aware of the most recent IPCC reports that have been coming out this week and recently that are obviously setting a fairly sort of grim scenario for our climate future. And at the same time, we see that legislative progress at the federal level, Build Back Better, has been stalled. There may now be some progress, but likely to come along with further oil and gas development. And then we, of course, also have everything that's happening in Russia and the Ukraine sort of as a backdrop for all of this and all of the dynamics that creates with oil prices and likely to be increases in food prices and other supply chain disruptions. And, I think I'll just maybe start out by saying, as somebody who has thought a lot about U.S. federal climate policy and was very involved around the election, I think, we were all really hopeful that we would see federal legislation. And, in many ways, I think some of us had and may be having a little PTSD from the 2008-2010 timeframe, where we also thought we would have federal legislation. I see some people laughing and maybe crying in acknowledgement or recognition of that timeframe. And I think at this point, it really does feel like the window for that legislative opportunity either is closed or is closing pretty quickly. And so just to set kind of the scene for this conversation, and the title of this session is around realistic expectations. So I think we want to talk about, obviously, I think there's room to continue the conversation about legislation, and there are some different legislative avenues beyond Build Back Better, where I think we're seeing members of Congress trying to push forward, if not climate legislation, then climate-related provisions in their legislation. But there are also a lot of other federal enablers for climate action, including cooperation with state and local governments, the regulatory landscape, the recent SEC rules, which I think Rick will talk about a little bit, administrative actions. And so I think we want to try to not get too Debbie Downer on this panel, but also want to kind of paint a picture of, realistically where things are and where we think we might be able to make progress going forward. So I'm going to hand it over to Emily Wimberger first. Emily is a climate economist with the Rhodium Group. Prior to joining Rhodium, she was the chief economist for the California Air Resources Board. She's a brilliant mind who has spent a lot of time thinking about climate policy and the economics of climate policy and the different pathways to the types of reductions that are consistent with a climate safe future. And so I'm going to hand it over to Emily to take it away.
Thank you. And thank you for coming. And yes, we're going to be very optimistic. This is a very optimistic panel. We can be realistic and optimistic at the same time. And I think a lot of the conversations that have been happening over the past couple of days really go to show, even in the absence of potential federal action or state action, that there are, there's new technologies, there's new investments being made, and there's a lot of energy into the clean tech space and the clean energy space. And it's really trying to figure out how to harness that and really trying to then broaden that and take that from, a theoretical target to implementation. So I do think there's a lot of optimism, but I'm also going to show you some graphs and charts that maybe will make you think differently. So in October of last year, Rhodium, we did a report called Pathways to Paris. And what we were trying to do is to find, was there a realistic pathway to get to the 2030 target? So the 2030 NDC of a 50 to 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And spoiler alert, We can, but this is sort of the lay of the land. So I wanted to put this up here to show sort of where we've come, where we need to go to hit that 2030 target. So this really shows this is US emissions, and I'm going to focus on US today. So this shows the US greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 through the current level. And then the blue little triangle you see, that's what we project if there's no additional policy action, where the US will be in 2030. And so that range accounts for uncertainty and thinking about sort of the ability of natural working lands to absorb carbon, changes in technology and energy costs. But really, so if we don't do anything, we're going to hit 17 to 25% below 2005 levels by 2030. That's a pretty big gap from where we need to be. And so this, you can see there's a gray bar on the bottom, the US Paris Agreement target, it's pretty substantial. And so the gap between that is between 1.7 and 2.3 billion tons. It's a big number. It's roughly equivalent to, at the highest, the US power sector and ag emissions, and at the lowest, it's current US transportation emissions. So it's a pretty big gap to close. But as I said, what we showed is that you can get there. So what we modeled, again, this is through 2030, and the blue is, what happens if the US does not implement any new policies. So what we did is we said, hey, we want to take a realistic look. We're not just going to set targets and say, what if the US achieves, what if every state looks like California? What if the federal government adopts all of California's suite of policies and targets? What we did is a really bottom-up approach that was thinking about, where are there actions that there is existing authority for that have been demonstrated in different capacities, how to expand those and think about realistic actions that can be taken. So we call this our joint action scenario. And what this does show that if all hands on deck, so if there's action across all levels of government, that the US can achieve the US NDC and we can get between 45 and 51% below 2030 by 2030 below 2005 levels. So it's possible. And I'm going to show you though what it actually takes. So this is sort of a little dash of cold water. So here's what we modeled. So to get to the US 2030 NDC, it takes action across, it's basically all hands on deck. It's congressional action, it's action from the federal government, and it's really aggressive action from states. So what we modeled was basically infrastructure bill, Build Back Better, and then we had really stringent EPA regulations, looking at new source performance standards, light duty vehicle, CAFE standards. And then we also had different states. Basically, we modeled what if all US climate aligned states adopted California's programs. So we didn't think, what if Alabama goes crazy? What if Texas does things? We said, hey, where are the climate leading states? And what if they just went farther and sort of adopted California's suite of policies? So as you can see, this is a pretty long list of things that would need to happen. And what we did find is that you would need to have action across all of these different levels to achieve the target. So as Aimee pointed out, Build Back Better is, who knows, what is Joe Manchin thinking today? But without that, it really does put us in a position where we need to see even more aggressive action, either from the federal government or from states. And I think one thing that we don't see here that Aimee sort of alluded to is that there are other federal enablers. So we've seen a whole host of different, corporations making commitments towards, investments in clean energy. And so there are other players in the game that really can have a sizable role and really sort of help fill in gaps where there might be gaps if there isn't congressional action or if we don't see really strong federal legislation from the federal government. So this is all to say, so we can achieve 2030, and this is kind of a Debbie Downer slide actually, so I apologize. But what this does show is by sector on the left-hand side, where we need to get to be to achieve that 2030 target. So we're seeing pretty substantial reductions across all sectors. And again, it's not just one sector, it's not just one policy, it's not just one level of government. We would really need to see action on every sector, every level of government. So if we get to 2030, so if we achieve that 2030 US target, it's not the only target we have. So, the IPCC and Saines says that we really need to get to zero net carbon by 2050. So even if we implement this whole host of policies across every level in the US, it's still a pretty steep curve to get to 2050. And so it's really important for us to think about not just sort of the actions that we need to get to 2030, but those actions might not be the same that will get us to 2050. And so it's really important to think about sort of, yes, we want to get to 2030, but we need to start making investments in the technologies, in the new energy sources to really get to that 2050 target. That's going to be a pretty heavy lift. And with that, I will turn it back over. So yes, it's feasible.
Thanks, Emily. I guess one quick follow-up question, and then we'll turn to Rick. But curious. So you talked about, obviously, Build Back Better. Who knows? Maybe there's going to be a sort of more a smaller package of that's passed from the original Build Back Better. And then at the same time, I think a lot of people are now looking at the infrastructure law that was passed and thinking about how you can squeeze sort of the maximum emission reductions out of the infrastructure law. Curious if you modeled that, or just if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so basically when we were modeling the infrastructure bill, we said that basically you would take actions that would achieve the greatest greenhouse gas emission reductions within that space. So for every pot of funding that we would see the actions implemented that would really prioritize greenhouse gas emission reduction. So yes, we did take that into account. And I think it is important to note that there is overlap between all of these things too. So if you see, if there's funding in the infrastructure bill, that helps reduce the costs of states taking action. And so there really is, there's lots of belts and suspenders, but that can be really good. It can, if there is something that falls through or doesn't sort of come to fruition, that you do have sort of a backup. But there's also, it can amplify reductions and help accelerate reductions when you're seeing sort of incentives across multiple sources.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, what's so striking to me from your presentation is just how much the choices that we're making today really matter for where we need to get, by 2030 or 2050. And I know we were at an event together in January or February with folks from Georgetown who had just put out a report about sort of the different ways that transportation investments could influence emissions. So obviously, if you're investing in widening freeways, that takes your emissions trajectory in one direction. If you're investing in, charging infrastructure, public transportation infrastructure, that takes your emissions trajectory another direction. So really interesting. Well, we'll come back to questions. And again, if anybody in the audience has questions for either of our panelists, please do start to think about them and get ready, because we'd love to make this, sort of an open conversation. Rick, would love to turn to you now. And, you're a person that I think many folks in this room know. I know you and I have probably some of the same battle scars from Waxman-Markey and that whole era of work together. And so would love just sort of your lay of the land, but also specifically, for this audience, thinking about people who are working in carbon markets, thinking about people who are working in carbon finance. We have seen the administration, for example, with these new SEC rules coming out, using some of their financial levers and enablers to push climate policy in the right direction. What's your take on where things stand?
Well, thanks, Aimee. Really great to see you, and Emily, great data and analysis. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, you're very clear. Nope, and now you're frozen.
Okay, great. Really sorry about there.
Now
okay?
You're good.
You're back.
Okay, I'm back. That's great. So if I freeze or whatever, let me know. Hopefully it's not too glitchy. And I'm really sorry I'm not there. I just, recovering from COVID, so I didn't want to risk other people's situations by going. I feel fine, but again, really sorry I'm not there. So look, it's a bleak picture in some ways. Am I there?
You are, yeah.
Okay, it's a bleak picture in some way. Okay, but here's the way that I tend to look at it. I think we have to move past the wait for federal government, to answer the call, to solve the problem. And that's not to say that the federal government doesn't have a huge role in helping enable the conditions that will result in the kinds of dramatic transformation that is, identified in the charts that Emily together. But the fundamentals, how that's going to be achieved, are actually more about capital market investment and return on investment. So we have to get to the point where each of those solutions, imperatives that are identified, in that long list of things, they have to be viewed as opportunities, and they have to be opportunities, realistic opportunities. So that begs the question as to what role can the federal government play in helping to, partner with the private sector. And I'm encouraged by the notion of this whole of government approach. We've seen this before when our battle scars, when the American Power Act was, not successful. There was a view to say, okay, what are all of the existing legislative authorities that all the agencies can do, and then add that up, and then that can do what we can propose, and work within that context. And of course, then you have challenges of our democratic.
Rick, you're breaking up a little bit. I wonder if you go off camera, if that might help to, yeah.
Let me try it. Yeah. It's probably better for everybody in the audience anyway.
We miss seeing your face, but let's see if that works.
Okay, so let me just keep going. If it's not good, let me know.
Okay.
So back when the American Power Act didn't go forward, the world was a very different place in some ways, because the cost curves hadn't reached a level of parity with the incumbent technologies. And if you just look at cost curve, you want to see a dramatic graph that shows a line that goes very steeply down. Look at the cost curve for installed solar and wind. It's incredible how fast that's happened. And so, I think we need to look at the incentive programs, the partnering programs, USDA's $1 billion investment in pilot programs with farmers to look at climate smart ag. There's going to be good stuff that comes out of that. And we need it. And then, some of the incentives and these moonshot things from DOE around hydrogen and storage and CCS and so forth. So I don't think the answer is in federal legislation. I don't think we're going to get there that way. I think we need to squeeze every ounce of reductions we can out of that, but it's going to be a mosaic approach, and there's going to be, wins and losses, but ultimately the capital markets need to pivot, and they need to go all in on investing in our future. And one of the key levers that will be triggered by is this climate risk disclosure, which the SEC proposed rule, I think is going to be profound in that regard. And we could talk more about that, but I'll stop there for now, just to let the technology catch up.
You're coming through loud and clear now, so that's great. And I think it seems like sort of the resounding consensus is, on the legislative front, it's going to be difficult, if impossible, to make progress again on sort of climate legislation. That said, I know there are pieces of legislation like the Competes Act, which is really focused on US competitiveness vis-a-vis China, that has a number of provisions to support clean energy and clean energy competitiveness that I know, folks are excited about. So, I guess curious if there are any other sort of legislative avenues that you're seeing that may not be Build Back Better, but may have climate friendly provisions. And then also, I think, Rick, to your point, would also love to think about, are there executive actions? Obviously, the president, shortly after he was inaugurated, did his January 27th executive order, which established a number of targets and programs, including the Justice 40 initiative. We haven't seen a whole lot from the White House since then in terms of climate executive action. So, is that an avenue? And then we also have, administrative and, again, sort of regulatory avenues for progress. So, Rick, I know you were maybe going to speak a little bit to the SEC guidelines that are coming out. Would love to hear that. And then also just open it up to both you and Emily, if you think there are other realistic enablers that we might want to talk about today.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And, look, hopefully most folks know that, I'm not a securities lawyer, but I am a lawyer, and focus a lot of my time on climate policy and so forth. And so this is the kind of initiative that you scrutinize pretty carefully. And I think that the proposal, and again, it's a proposed rule, comment period is now. And for those people that are interested in advancing climate progress in the United States, whether you are a heavy emitter, whether you are a financial institution, a project developer, part of the infrastructure of the carbon markets, now is the time to step up and be full-throated in support of the notion of real transparency, consistency, reliability, and comparability in climate risk disclosures as called for under that proposal. It is the kind of thing that the big institutional investing class are looking for. They are calling for it. We could debate, whether GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which represents 130 trillion in assets under management, how impactful and organized and so forth, and what is their actual mandate. It is already paying dividends to have mobilized that group of institutions and alliances, because it represents the signal for market demand for this information. All of these associations, these net zero alliances, have made commitments to achieve net zero, and they need the information from the markets to be able to better allocate capital in a more climate risk attuned way. And the risks are real, they just haven't been priced into our system yet. So this type of a proposal is really profound. And I'd note that there's a discussion on carbon offsets and RECs in there. It goes beyond just saying, look, report your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. It goes into questions about goal setting and targets. And if you have goals and targets, you need to identify how you intend to achieve them. And if you intend to use offsets and RECs as part of your net zero targets and goals, you need to describe that. And I think that's a really healthy, important component of making the financing system better aligned with a low carbon growth trajectory. And none of the stuff that needs to happen is going to happen by a magic wand that the president or Congress can just do. And even if we had an aligned Congress, you still need capital market, you still need the investors and the profit seekers to find opportunity in the solutions. So, I think the SEC proposed rule is a real important moment for our community. And, I'm hopeful that, and rest assured, there will be opponents. It will be challenged. It will be sent through the crucible, both in terms of the comment period and then ultimately what the final rule looks like, and probably litigation. Let's be realistic. The greater support from the broader market community is manifested in the comments, the greater evidence that SEC is not, kind of legislating from the administrative branch. They're actually responding to the market demand that exists out there. And that's really important. So I'll leave it there for the SEC.
That's great.
We can come back on something else around framing and other things later, but I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, I mean, and I think it's a great, call to action for folks in this room, and a point that, I think that the SEC guidance is not necessarily a foregone conclusion, and we do need, the people in this room and in lots of other rooms weighing in support of this. And, I guess one quick follow-on question I had for you, kind of in that same vein, was just if you had any thoughts on the failed nomination of Sarah Bloom Raskin to the Fed. She was somebody who had been positioned as a climate champion. I think opponents had sort of cast her as a climate radical. But my understanding is that, the kinds of things she's been supportive of are wholly consistent with the direction that the Fed is taking anyway, and the direction that the market is taking anyway. So just curious if you had any thoughts on that, and then I'd love to kind of go to some state and local action.
I would say that the positions on the Fed are very highly specialized, in some respects, technical positions that are economically derived, or where there's a specialization for a particular mandate that the Fed has, to regulate rates and understand how to influence the cost of capital. And so, I totally understand the point you're making. That also came up around Secretary Yellen's climate counselor, and full disclosure, my good friend and former partner John Morton became Secretary Yellen's climate counselor. So I'm probably not the most objective person. I think John is doing a fantastic job, and in this SEC rule and other things that the Treasury is putting together. And then obviously the SEC put this together. The Treasury didn't do that. Treasury is very respectful of the regulatory bodies and doesn't put its thumb on the scale per se. But there is real leadership there, and I think there'll be room and opportunity for her, in other contexts.
Yeah. I want to turn to sort of state and non-state actor. Yeah. Go for it.
Sorry, and it's allergies, not COVID, so I apologize. No, and I think sort of speaking to Rick, that there is this demand for physical climate risk and understanding that. So Rhodium is a partner in the Climate Impact Lab, which is a partnership of the University of Chicago, Berkeley, Rutgers, and Rhodium. And I always say it's like the really smart academic people that work at Rhodium. But they've really dialed into there's this whole swath, there's new data, there's new technology, there's new ability to do computationally really challenging things to take historic data at a really granular level and really understand the hyper-local climate damages. And so we've had a partnership with BlackRock where basically we provided physical climate data to BlackRock for incorporation into their Aladdin platform. So we've seen that there are really big, when there's lots of investments being made and there's money at stake, people are really starting to think about this. We're seeing the real world impact of climate change, and now there is data to be able to really identify that and to build that into your investment decisions. And so we're starting to see that, and it's not just, so I think the writing is sort of, there is a louder drumbeat that it's not just sort of, the government imposing this, but there really is a demand in people as new information is made available that you want to incorporate that. You want to understand the uncertainties involved and not just sort of put your head in the sand, especially if you're in Miami because it might be underwater. But so I think we've seen that, and there really is a demand there. And as we get more sophisticated, with the use of this data, there's a whole host of things that we can do, and thinking about ways to leverage that in investment decisions, in infrastructure decisions. The Climate Impact Lab is also working very closely with the federal government on the social cost of carbon update, and really trying to understand how we can sort of build, this new data and new physical climate risk data into the decisions that are made that maybe aren't sort of climate focused, but do have a climate element. I always say people have a little bit of carbon fatigue. And so if there are ways that you can sort of, pass legislation or have investments or pots of money that have sort of some climate elements, but that's really not the focus, that is a way that you can sort of incorporate and make smart climate decisions when you're making sort of decisions that might seem unrelated.
That's a great point. And so where I was going to go next, and I think this dovetails really well, is just going to sort of the state and local level. And, we have legislation proposed here in California that would require climate risk disclosure. I think if that passes, we might see that be a model for other states across the country. When the Trump administration essentially undid the social cost of carbon, we saw states pick up that mantle and continue that work forward. And so I think now we're in an interesting situation where we have obviously an administration that is desiring to take action, but really stymied in some ways by obviously legislative challenges. And so I think, in some ways it's not that different, right? We're still looking at how can states and local governments and non-state actors, so businesses, investors, civil society, universities, the whole gamut, how can they kind of, move forward? Just curious about your thoughts, both from your Rhodium perspective and then from before being at CARB.
I think it was right after Trump got elected, and it was the COP in Morocco. And so we landed, we're like the California delegation, and everyone's like, please tell us that all is not lost. It was like all eyes were sort of on California, because it was like, oh my gosh, like we don't know what's happening to the US writ large, but like, please tell us. And like the overwhelming message, we both worked in the government at that point, was like, we're still here. Like states are still here. We're still in it. And we have the tools, we have the authority, and we have the will to do this. And so I think, to your point, we have seen states step up. And the majority of, in the past decade, the majority of climate ambition really has been at the state level. We've seen states take really big strides. And it's not just states like California, but we've seen a whole host of different states across the country really think about sort of, not just, we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but how to sort of stimulate their economy, how to create local markets, how to really drive employment, and to think about equity issues in their local regions. And so I think it's a really good opportunity to think about the role of states, and not just, the climate aligned states, but we've seen states across the country thinking about low carbon fuel standards because they see the economic benefit there. Midwestern states are thinking about this in ways that maybe aren't really associated with climate reductions, but are really trying to generate economic activity in their region. So I do think there's a really big role. And again, it's like, how do you think about you want all levels of government to sort of amplify each other. So if there are congressional incentives, how do states sort of, use those to sort of, maybe accelerate their ambition or accelerate reductions or accelerate, the advancements of technology. And so I think there are places, where it does make sense for states to sort of lead. And we've seen California has, done a really great job in thinking about the transportation space and really advancing, there's really strong targets when it comes to zero emission vehicles in California. And now we're waiting to see the implementation. So I think there's also, there's a need for states to sort of adopt, really ambitious targets, but we also need to see sort of boots on the ground. And the really unsexy part of climate is when you actually have to do the work. And I think that's the part that we need to see across local governments, and local governments have a huge role in that, because you can't build infrastructure if you don't get permitting at the local level. So it's really trying to think about, all the different pieces and how different levels of government fit together at the local, the state, and the federal level to really amplify and accelerate sort of what we can do on climate. I think the other piece is, climate doesn't exist in a vacuum, and there are huge equity considerations that vary all across the country. And we will really want to make sure that, there's that the most disadvantaged communities are really seeing benefits for reductions, and both in terms of, reductions in, the changing temperature, but also in regards to air pollution and thinking about public health. So I think there are really big ways that states and local governments can really leverage those other pieces and thinking about equity, and how do you sort of build, have an equity forward policy or program, but then have sort of climate considerations that are really built into it.
Great. All right, I'm going to ask one more question of both of you, and then if there are any audience questions, please do raise your hand. So one thing that I was thinking about as you were talking, Emily, was just, for the people in this room who may want to be tracking, policy because it's relevant to their business, this fractured landscape where we have federal action, we have state action, we have local action, can be really overwhelming to kind of keep track of where everything is headed. And so that to me feels like a sort of big policy related challenge. But there obviously are also opportunities that are being created by policy, including, the infrastructure law, which is going to be pushing out billions of dollars, that can be used to invest in infrastructure, everywhere from resilience related to EV charging, to equity related investments, water infrastructure. So what are you both seeing as sort of the greatest challenges and opportunities in the sort of US federal climate policy space right now?
Maybe I can jump in there.
Yeah,
Please.
So I'm really glad we started talking about, local government and states. And one of the things I think is likely to be the case is that there will be federal block grants or pools of capital money that will be pushed down to states. And I think it'd be really good for states to start to position themselves to be recipients of that. And one of the ways that the states will, probably uh, fare better in terms of early access to some of this capital and so forth is having a real cogent climate strategy for how they would basically deploy these federal grants. If EPA is going to administer, some multi-billion-dollar grant program, for example. And one of the things that, is a feature of some of the leading states is the state green banks. So you have Connecticut, Hawaii, a number of others that have demonstrated that they can organize themselves around a state-driven priority, whether it's in the built environment or otherwise, to energy, transport, to create institutions that have the capacity to actually deploy that capital. Last mile deployment, as you said, the boots on the ground, really the messy work. It's just really critical. It's not enough to sort of move pots of money around from one account to another. I mean, this stuff actually has to get going into the building our future. And so I just, I think there's a huge opportunity to, as you say, to create that coherence between federal policy, and deployment of incentives and grant monies and so forth into these various programs. And that's where the action is. And just look at cities and livable, thriving cities. Like, what is the vision for how we're going to make our cities, be exemplars for the next 50 to 100 years? And when you start looking at that, there's so many integrated opportunities, synergistic integrated opportunities that, and the cities need the resources to do it. Their tax base is not sufficient to do it on their own, but with the right institutional environment and channeling of those funds, and then you blend in private investment opportunities into some of these solutions, it's a really exciting opportunity, and we just have to start getting excited about it and doing it at scale fast.
Yeah. I think that's a huge challenge and an opportunity. I mean, truly billions of dollars that, folks in this room, I think will need to play a key role in helping deploy in ways that drive down emissions. I think we have seen already from some of the ARA funds, that are going out through EDA, people are already starting to apply for that funding and think about how they can use it in climate related ways. And over the course of this year, we're going to see a lot of the money from the infrastructure law starting to get pushed out, around, again, EV charging infrastructure, starting to, water infrastructure, some of the resilience funding. And all of those will need good private sector partners to help, build that infrastructure, consult on those projects. So I think there is an incredible opportunity for folks in this room, as a result of that. But Emily, would love your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think it's a huge challenge, and I think it's to your point earlier, like how do we make sure that we're deploying these funds in the the most carbon effective way? And it's really challenging, and a lot of states don't have the capacity that California does, and it's still a challenge in the state of California to figure out how to leverage all of these federal funds to really to do the work across the board. And so I think there is a need for there to be sort of a tighter connection, and for there to be a greater understanding between states and cities and local governments in terms of what are the opportunities that are out there. There's all these pots of money, which is great, but they're all tied up in their own little with requirements that people grant writing requirements, and oftentimes small players who are the actual communities that you really want to be invested in climate adaptation and mitigation, they don't have the access to understand or just the knowledge needed to sort of the awareness of these funds. And so I really think there is a huge role to be played, and I do think that private entities do have a role there in trying to sort of leverage this. And if there's private public partnerships that can work, you really can leverage and take those federal dollars farther and really implement them in ways that you will see significant reductions in local communities, in states, and across the nation. But I think it's a really big challenge, and just it's really complicated, and it's got to be a two-way street. So it's not just, there's federal funds and like there's states. It's like it needs to be, the states need to be aware of what's happening at the federal level, and also there needs to be some, that the federal government needs to be aware of like what actually works for states, and if there are restrictions where states can't really deploy federal funds in ways that are intended, I think that's a really important piece too that needs to be discussed.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody fix that problem.
Any questions from the audience? I have another question or two, but yeah, right here.
Yeah, so speaking of the build, what used to be Build Back Better, I think we heard about 15 days ago some interest by Senator Manchin to move the pared down climate-specific package forward before they adjourn in summer. I guess, what is the panel's outlook on the pure politics of that moving forward? And then associated with that, maybe separate efforts to move specific issues related to climate, like 45Q expansion and extension forward outside of the larger broader.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great question. Rick, do you want to start?
Yeah, I could start. Yeah, and I didn't want to sort of start to conclude this panel on another depressing but in all seriousness, I mean, I think we're having a really good sort of insular conversation about U.S. specific politics, but there's also global energy markets, and we have an atrocity in Ukraine that is affecting that, and it rightly is affecting the thinking about what is the U.S. response to that. And there is likely to be an increase in U.S. sourced fossil production, but I would say rightly so. And I think this gets to the question that was just asked. I think that the administration, the president, and so forth, you just listen to the way that they've articulated this. There is a big bargain to be struck here around short-term response to the crisis, to once and for all wean ourselves off of Russian-sourced oil, and Europe. This is primarily a Europe conversation, but it's a bigger point, which is to say the long-term global geopolitical security significance of relying on these types of sources for our energy. And in the context of energy security, what does sustainable fossil production and use, sustainable natural gas look like? And I think it goes to 45Q. I think it goes to a real serious uptick in carbon capture and storage. But it also goes to doubling down on, ultimately, once and for all, pivoting away from fossils as the strategy. And these are moments where, you can't just think of this as a, what's the U.S. federal policy. This is a bigger discussion about global security and so forth. And that's the politics of the moment. So I think the opportunity for climate-related provisions of Build Back Better are in a perverse and unfortunate way, or outcome, potentially strengthened in the context of a bigger discussion about global energy security. And there are trade-offs, but I think the short-term trade-offs could result in longer-term strategic movements towards, actually getting something done there.
Emily?
No, I think Rick made great points there. I think I don't have a crystal ball, and I feel like we've been burned a bunch on Build Back Better. So I also sort of don't want to be a downer, but I think there's the tax incentives and the extension of that makes sense. And there seems to be pretty wide agreement that is beneficial across the board. And so I'm optimistic that, we will see 45Q, we will see, some of these existing tax tax breaks extended. And I think that makes sense. And when that will happen, or I think to Rick's point, I think it gets rolled into a larger discussion, and maybe gets sort of, Build Back Better, officially burns to the ground, and like those provisions get then packaged into something else that maybe is a little bit more targeted in thinking about sort of where we want to go in the longer term, not based on climate, but just based on the role of the U.S. in energy markets writ large. So I think we will see those, but I don't know when and under what context. We'll see. But I mean there's huge, and those are the biggest pieces of Build Back Better that really get you really big reductions. And again, that really helps amplify anything that states are doing. And it really does. I mean, it improves they improve air quality, and they really help sort of accelerate reductions and getting down that curve. So.
I may not be an answer to this question, so sorry to put you on the spot, but has Rhodium looked at what the potential emissions increases as a result of the war in Ukraine or increased US exploitation of domestic resources, how that would sort of counter what you'd get in terms of the benefits of emission reductions from tax incentives?
We have, but in a very back of the envelope way.
Okay.
So yeah, I think that's been a really big question. And part of it is and part of it is the timing of everything. And, just because you're going to sort of open up exploration or you're going to sort of maximize domestic production, that doesn't happen overnight. And so it's really, there's a time element there and thinking about sort of what that response will look like and how long that will take. Yes, it would result in emissions going up, but then again, to Rick's point, sort of, what is happening globally and how do we put this in context? And, sometimes it seems, yes, climate change should be the number one priority globally, and otherwise we're all going to burn. But there really are, there are other priorities that we need to take into consideration. And it's not just it's not just how do we get to the lowest cost, emission reductions. There are other things that we need to take into consideration. So yes, we've done some back of the envelope, but we haven't done anything official. I think if there's an official response, the thought was then we would model that and come out with that.
Yeah. Great.
And just another point on that. I mean, I guess what I was trying, maybe not saying as clearly though, is that I think if you look at the global, it's one atmosphere, right? So the U.S. spike in production, it's going to be done in a manner that is actually probably more environmentally, more efficient, more sensitive to the life cycle of GHGs. And if we can define a way of doing a lower carbon fuel that can be delivered to Europe than otherwise would be the case from other sources of production, and at the same time we can invest in the massive amounts of investments and opportunities. These are investments, not costs, investments in the new energy infrastructure for Europe and the world, and build it here in the United States. It's a pivotal moment that has like a long-term strategic implication, and which is aligned with the climate objectives. So it's putting those things together and understanding the short-term imperative with the long-term strategy and finding out how you do it. And I'm not saying there is, I had the answer to that or anything, but I do think that is the kind of stuff that, we should feel really good about this administration being all over understanding that, and not just, there are two reactions to the crisis. One is climate be damned. I actually heard Tucker Carlson say that when I was at the airport and forced to watch Fox News. Climate be damned. We need energy security. It's just a false premise. And so I think the administration is way more strategic about it. And we need to really lean into embracing how we solve this crisis, strengthen alliances, and then build the momentum for the overall strategic pivot to say enough is enough, no more wars that are fueled and funded by fossil fuels. It's just, this is the moment where I think we can bring some of those things together. And I think the administration is going to work to do that.
And I should say, I was speaking more from sort of the US context, that US emissions could increase. I think, yes, globally, it's, it makes a lot of sense, but it also, you want to make sure that your short-term response to the crisis doesn't put you on track to then derail from your longer-term US goals in terms of, getting off of fossil fuels and really making that transition. So I think, yes, Rick, you're right. Like, this is a pivotal moment, but we need to make sure that it isn't sort of, too reactionary, and that we are keeping, that we can have a short-term response that doesn't derail us from our long-term trajectories that we need to get to in terms of really weaning off fossil fuels.
Yeah, and I was going to say, to the original questioner's question and sort of the political realities of this, my sense is that particularly some of the more progressive, the members of the more progressive end of the Democratic Party, I think, are very focused on, we've heard them talk about just, we've been going through these sort of cycles of, global instability, the need to increase production, and really the ultimate solution to all of that is to transition off of fossil fuel. If we live in a post-fossil fuel world, we don't have people like Vladimir Putin holding the kind of power that they do, right? So I think it is sort of, I think in terms of how the political dynamics in the US are likely to play out, I think there will be members of the congressional delegation that will want to have some degree of reassurance that, exactly to your point, if there are any short-term increases, A, those are short-term, B, given the time lag that takes place when especially if you're talking about exploration, that it actually makes sense and is going to be able to provide relief in any meaningful window of time. And, also that is truly just a short-term measure on the way to a long-term renewable energy, low carbon future. Any other questions from the room? We're getting called on time, but I had just one last question. If I could, maybe like a 30-second response from both Rick and Emily to close us out. As you might have been able to tell from the beginning of the panel, I've been suffering from a lot of climate-related dread and anxiety recently with the IPCC reports coming out, and was talking to a colleague yesterday about it, and we were talking about the fact that actually the thing that gives us hope is just sort of people. People can be horrible and make horrible decisions, and we're seeing a lot of that on the global stage right now. But and I've only been here for a few hours, but being able to be in community with all of you and be at an event where there are so many people who are focused on doing the right thing is really heartening to me. So I hate a sort of like, are you an optimist or a pessimist question, but like, is there something, action is the antidote to despair, right? So what is an action either that you are taking or you recommend that people in this room take to stave off the despair that we may otherwise feel from the very sobering reports we're seeing?
I think Rick made a good point. It's like, weigh in, comment on things, like be part of the process to get this done. Like this doesn't happen in a vacuum, and actually comment letters, as someone who had to read a lot of them at the Air Resources Board, they do actually matter. And I think that there is an opportunity for people to weigh in and to voice what you think and where you think things should be headed. And this, this doesn't happen. We don't have a dictator in the US. Fortunately, so that this is a public process, and there are ways that people can get engaged, both on the regulatory side, the legislative side, and you can vote with your dollars. Put your money and your efforts into things that you believe in, and that will drive carbon reductions. And I think the more people, the bigger groundswell. And yes, seeing everyone here, especially coming out of COVID, has been awesome. And it is really heartening that there's so many opportunities, there's so many technologies and opportunities for investments and really economic growth that will really drive this. So I'm optimistic on that front.
Okay, Rick.
Yeah, I'm optimistic too in a realistic way. We've already baked in a certain degree of suffering for ourselves and future generations. However, when you look at the IPCC report and they identify across all of the various sectors, where are all the opportunities that are $100 per ton reductions and less? That is the playbook for opportunities for all the people in the room to build their businesses around the solutions. The world is going to be desperate for these solutions, and the economic opportunities to build the low carbon future are huge. It is a massive, wonderful economic opportunity if we make it such. And I think as we reprice risk, climate risk, understand it better through some of these new regulatory initiatives, which, by the way, are not just in the US. I mean, the US is lagging behind, Europe and so forth in this regard. That's movement. And so then the question is, let's make sure that the business community and the financial markets are ready to pivot and to actually scale. And that capital shift needs a place to go. So we need the innovators, the entrepreneurs, the technology designers, and the businesses that are in this room, to be ready for scale, because the capital's coming and we want it to land in a good place.
All right, well, there's your homework. The capital's coming. You all are responsible for making sure it lands in a good place. Weigh in on 45Q, weigh in on Build Back Better, weigh in on SEC guidelines. Go out there and do what you all are doing, because I think, again, action is the antidote to despair. So we need your action. Thank you all for participating, and let's give a round of applause for our panelists.
Bye, Amy. Bye, Emily.